Hi, my name is Mike Snow, and I want to talk about this book, King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild. Back in the mid-90s, a group of historians from France made a book called The Black Book of Communism, and it listed all of the horrendous acts of violence and cruelty and tried to calculate the number of deaths that communism had caused during the 20th century. That book seemed to suggest in its pages that there was no corresponding black book of capitalism, that there was no black book of evil pre-communist state terror. And this book seems to serve as some sort of an answer to it. There was a book made called The Black Book of Capitalism in a response to it, but this is a much punchier example of it. King Leopold's Ghost talks about the most horrendous act of mass murder that ever occurred before the 20th century. The mass murder of the people of the Congo during the late 19th and early 20th centuries is nightmarish. It led to the death in just a few decades of 10 million people. Now stew that over in your mind for a bit. 10 million people. Some from disease, some from overwork, some from malnourishment, and plenty from outright murder and brutality. 10 million people were killed in the Congo during that time. And this is the remarkable story about that. The story is set in the late 19th century during the era of European colonization, but it was really in the 1870s and afterwards when the fever to take over, to carve up Africa like a cake, as they literally described it as, really set in amongst Europeans. And one of the biggest areas was dead at the center, the Congo. There's been a long debate about whether colonization was an overall benefit or hazard to the people involved. On the one hand, the pro-colonization scale, they were taking medieval or pre-medieval societies and elevating them to modern states. Admittedly completely dysfunctional, poverty-stricken modern states, but it's better to be a miserable modern state than a pre-modern medieval state. The liberal side of this is that colonization was a terrible crime, a vicious, murderous act of robbery. And where the truth lies is somewhere in between, because Europeans didn't always take from their colonies. In fact, for the most part, the colonies required money being sent to them to run. The amount that they were able to take in tax and resources from the colony tended to be much lower than the amount sent by European powers to garrison soldiers, to put down rebellions, to build railways, to build infrastructure, to build some semblance of modernity, the late 19th century version of that, in these African countries. But the Congo tale is unique. There is no half-hearted or even basic attempt to try to create a real state, to try to live up to the ideals of bringing benefits to the Africans. One of the most devious and horrendous villains in all of world history, and I really mean that. He should be up there with Stalin and Pol Pot and the rest of them. And he was even responsible for more murders than some of the more horrendous dictators out there of the 20th century. And that is King Leopold. You can see him here on the cover with his spade-shaped white beard and bald head. King Leopold is one of the most devious people who have ever lived, maybe the most devious person who's ever lived. He spent decades crafting what's referred to in the book as a secret society of murderers. He was so clever, was so brilliant, he was able to trick the United States and every single one of the great powers of Europe into letting the Congo be taken over by him in his tiny little country of Belgium. I don't have time to explain it, it's in the book, but this act of persuasion and secretiveness and lies and bribery is maybe the greatest act of corruption in all of human history. How he gamed and played and lied to the European powers for years to try to create this horrendous money machine in the Congo. He wanted to give tiny little Belgium this gigantic area of land 80 times the size of his country. Another enduring historical question that is still resonant nowadays is, was Adolf Hitler considered as serious a threat as he became later on. It seems that in his home country of Germany, he was not considered that serious a threat and was not going to lead the country to the disaster he brought it to. But whether or not the European powers considered him a threat, that's hard to say. Some of them did, some in different parties did. It depends on what time you look at what he did, but it seems clear they didn't take him as a serious threat for until the very late 30s, when it became obvious to everyone. The reason I bring that up is because King Leopold was routinely allowed to get away with things for decades because people made a huge mistake. They didn't consider him a threat. Nowadays, whether dictators in some obscure part of the country are truly threatening to world peace and are capable of acts of mass murder is something we still haven't satisfactorily been able to answer. Should we intervene or shouldn't we? That's still a question we're asking today, and Leopold got away with it. He was an amazing trickster. A huge part of the reason that he was able to get away with all the things he did is because people didn't take him seriously. You know, you read what the people in the Foreign Office in Britain thought of him. They thought of him as a joke. They laughed at him. Even people in his home country of Belgium laughed at him. Usually not being considered a serious threat is a bad thing. You want people to think that you're tough and strong and intimidating. But Leopold, brilliant schemer that he was, knew that, no, that's not a hindrance. That's important. That's good. That's useful that people don't think I'm serious. And he used that to his advantage. He used their lack of attention to what he was doing, or lack of belief that he could ever do anything bad, to do horrendous, nightmarish things, maybe the greatest crime of the 19th century, as I said. He played all of the brilliant people, the most brilliant minds of the day, against one another, and came out on top. That is an amazing act. After he was essentially given license to take over the Congo, and I do have to stress that the United States is part of this. We were one of those people that he duped. In fact, we were the first country internationally to recognize the Congo as a legitimate state. So this isn't something that took place over 100 years ago and strictly in European terms. The United States is well in this, and we are partly responsible for what happened, as everyone who let him get away with this. After being given the right to govern the country, King Leopold silkily stepped out of a lot of provisos of civilization that the great powers tried to strip on him, and essentially ran it as his personal kingdom. This was something the only unique in the colonization of Africa. It was the only African colony that was the property of a single person. The other ones were ostensibly owned by France, Britain, Germany, etc. This was governed by not Belgium originally, but just one single man, King Leopold, the Roi de Belgique, the King of the Belgians. I like that his name is a declaration, not a title. And that was another thing against him. People laughed at him because he was losing money for so many years. But that just gave him this extraordinary cover, because eventually he was able to take enormous quantities out of this country. This is one of the most clear-cut cases where the Marxist interpretation of colonization is 100% accurate. This was just a horrendous, brutal act of exploitative capitalism where the country was provided with nothing. They were given nothing. They were given no infrastructure. They were given nothing at all. During the when the Congo became independent, over slightly under 100 years later, in the early 1960s, there were under 10 people in the country that had college degrees. Under 10 people. That's astonishing that little civilizing process went on in the country, that not even the requisite number of people to fill parliament had attended college. That boggles the mind. Leopold systematically drained the Congo of its resources, originally ivory, but then especially rubber. There was a rubber boom that came around in the 1890s, especially because of the bicycle and the early automobiles. And Leopold sucked dry everything that he got and ran the most brutal and rapacious group of people that had been around since the slave trade. The way they gathered the rubber is hellish. I mean, it must have been like living in hell for the people of the Congo. What they would do is that the Congo would send its soldiers, who were, for the most part, except for the officers, black Africans, the officers were white, send them into a village, round up everybody in there, and it would be virtually impossible to run away because they would scour the countryside around them and drag everyone back, and would be punished if you tried to run away initially. And they would hold the women and children hostage, literally in a stockade, like in prison, until all of the menfolk brought back all of the rubber that was required of that village. It's gangsterish. You know, they would say, we're going to put a gun to the head of your wife and child unless you go out there and get all of the rubber we want. And the guards had the most utmost brutality for everyone that they dealt with. They brutalized people with a jambok, here called a shakot, a whip that's made out of twisted rhinoceros hide that can leave think of that, like a screw twisted around, hardened and whipped across the buttocks or the back over and over again, sometimes until someone was dead. There were no laws. There's a chapter in here called Where There Ain't No 10 Commandments, and that's damn sure. There was no pretense of morality. It was a lot like the Ostreich in German times, not in the Nazi era during World War II. They created a vast lawless state in Eastern Europe where there was no culpability for raping someone, for killing someone, for doing anything. There were essentially no laws. They didn't apply to the subject population. And that's exactly the horror that these people created thanks to the Congo Free State. Mutilation was far from uncommon. In fact, that became the most notorious aspect of what happened, is that people would sometimes get their hands hacked off. And there were endless people that were discovered by missionaries who had been mutilated this way, with having one of their hands chopped off. The missionaries found tons of people with their arms or hands chopped off, even tiny children. You know, there's a 4 or 5 year old girl could have this happen to her. It was essentially hell. It was a nightmare down there. One of the biggest parts of the story is the reaction to it, and you really learn how modern this story really is, because a huge part of this story is about the reaction to all of this. For the first time since the British anti-abolitionist movement, a group of people in a Western power took notice of the sufferings of others. You know, it's one of those extraordinary acts of morality that, why does this happen? Why does this suddenly come up? People started to care again, and nowadays the idea of NGOs and helping out people in other countries and enormous charities and aid organizations is an ingrained part of our life. It's something that we take for granted, but back then this is really where that aid movement began. After it had died out, after the abolitionist movement achieved its goals. The hero of this story, the two heroes of this story, are a man named Edie Morrell and Roger Casement, two British people who fought for the liberation of the Congo from King Leopold and his secret society of murderers. They spent decades working on what was essentially the first modern propaganda campaign against the evils in the Third World, trying to struggle for the rights of people that were of a different color, who lived on another continent, thousands of miles away, that they had never met. And they met with huge popular success. It became a national movement in the early 1900s, a cause célèbre for all of Britain and a significant amount of the United States and the rest of Europe as well. The story, we also have to remember, though, takes place in the real world. You know, if we're reading a fictional account of something like this, the people would struggle really hard and they would win. But this is reality, and unfortunately, as so often happens, the people who struggled so hard to fight against this, who tried as hard as they could to stop King Leopold, ultimately failed. They ended up not really making a huge dent. I mean, there was an enormous moral victory. It was a great thing that they brought attention to what was going on down there, but ultimately they didn't stop it. They didn't win. They didn't, what they did didn't lead to the ending of the horrendous system that was brutalizing and killing and starving so many people in the Congo. In fact, it actually spread to the French Congo. It actually got bigger. He died one of the richest men who ever lived up till that point. He was extraordinarily wealthy. He drained everything from the Congo. He really is one of the most hateful figures in all of world history. I don't know how you could look at this guy and not despise him with every ounce of your soul. He was one of the most horrendous examples of mammon, of greed, of extreme avarice, literally at the cost of millions of lives, just to enrich one person. It didn't even have the fig leaf that the other colonies did of trying to bring civilization to the Africans living there. As dubious as that was, of course, at least they made an attempt, but he wasn't there. He lied and lied and lied again, all to enrich himself, all to give someone who was already extraordinarily wealthy, who was incredibly wealthy, even more money. You know, this really reminds me of one of my favorite movies, of Chinatown, when Jack Nicholson asked John Huston's character the immortal, unanswerable question, how much are you worth? 10 million, 15 million, more? Why? Why did you do it? How better can you eat? How better can you live? Why do you want it? And then John Huston's character, he actually answers the unanswerable. He says to this sort of hypothetical why did you do it? He says the future. And maybe that's why King Leopold did this, because he wanted to create something. He wanted, in one of the most terrible acts of egotism before Hitler, to impress himself upon the world. He even said for decades, Belgium must have a colony. And this became one of his guiding principles for years. He built gigantic monuments and edifices. He was a city builder. He liked to shape the world around him, which is a peculiar trait of dictators. Hitler was a fanatic about architecture, and he wanted to reshape all of the world. He even said at the end of the war that the Allied bombing raids were a good thing, in a way, because they allowed him a lot of free space to build upon. Leopold is one of the most criminal, hateful figures in all of history. This is one of the best history books I've ever read. It really reads like it's a crime thriller. You know, every single page is going to keep you turning, from amazing descriptions of the inhabitants of the Congo, to the brutalization they suffer, to the torture, to the murder, to the people exploring literally into the heart of darkness. This is the non-fiction version of Heart of Darkness. It really is. If you like Apocalypse Now or have read Heart of Darkness, read this book. This is absolutely fascinating. This is the real account of what happened. It wasn't just made up. People really did go out there into the wilderness in the Congo and lose their minds and commit horrendous depravities with the people they found there. Everything about this book I can't recommend highly enough. I've read it several times now. It's amazing. It's worth reading and rereading. It's exciting, it's fun, it's horrifying in a way that many horror books that I've read, where people are actually trying to be scary, it completely outclasses them. This is one of the most horrifying books ever read, and in a way, it's one of the most important history books written in the past 10 to 15 years, because King Leopold, for most of the 20th century, was winning. He was winning in history. You know how monstrous people sometimes say, history will vindicate me after some horrendous crime that they've committed, that they know they can't get away with. They'll say, oh, I'll be vindicated by history. Well, guess what? That has happened in multiple cases. And probably the worst case of this happening in the past 2 centuries is King Leopold, because he's virtually unknown, and before this book was published, almost completely unknown. And he really should be up there among Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot, among the absolute worst, horrendous excuses of human beings that ever lived. So this is truly important history. You have to read this to make sure, in some small way, that this nightmarish, horrid figure of a person, I don't even really want to call him a human being, this horrendous monster, gets away with it. Not reading this book, not finding out about this, not learning about this, helps him with his criminal conspiracy. We're abetting him after the fact. Maybe that's going a little bit too far, but that's how I feel about this. You have to read this book to make sure that we don't let something like this happen again. Because guess what's happening in the Congo over the past 10 to 15 years? Millions of people have died. Resources are being drained out of the country, particularly coltan, by Western powers, and nobody gives a damn. There's no E.D. Morrill out there who's trying to stop it. There's no Caseman out there who's looking for this stuff. You know, we're letting Leopold get away with his crimes if you don't read this book. And it is not just a joy to read, it's exciting. It gets our blood pumping reading about these murderers and criminals and the people that are frantically trying to stop them. It's absolutely great, highly recommended. Could not give it a higher recommendation. You have to read this book right now.